Check 1 2 1 2.
I think it's in the view. Cool.
So you just want to turn it on and off.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session on transparency. We have a set of 5 very exciting papers today. The first paper is by Paula Lopez, who will be talking about rethinking transparency as a communicative constellation.
So, hi everyone. I'm Paola from the University of Vienna, and today I present our paper, Rethinking Transparency as a Communicative Constellation. This is joint work with Florian Eyert from the Weizmann Institute in Berlin, and we'll just get right into it. Technological hypes, as we're experiencing right now with large language models, are complex phenomena and deeply connected to societal knowledge practices. And in terms of facilitating knowledge about machine learning systems, the literature within FACT has focused on technical methods like explainability and partially on the notions of disclosure and algorithmic literacy. It has not systematically engaged with the conditions necessary for broad deliberative discourse and the ways in which existing transparency effort can be brought into conversation with the general public. And in this paper, we address this gap by rethinking transparency as a communicative constellation. Our motivating observation is that there are many value choices in the development and deployment of algorithmic system. And a good example of this is actually prediction, something that we've heard a lot about on this conference already. And as a technical term, prediction consists in fitting a function to existing data points, and the pre in prediction is just a matter of definition and refers to inferring missing data from existing data. But economic and political and media discourses infuse this pre with non-technical meaning that leads to expectations of clairvoyant capabilities. But of course, we know we don't really predict the future. But when deployed to actually make statements about the future, this can have substantial effects for those that are affected. So taking the future to be like the past can be a source of injustice in its own right, as we've heard before as well on the FACT. So while there are many technical decisions to be made in such predictions, the decision to use machine learning to relate to and thereby shape and create the future in the first place is a fundamental value choice and thus a deeply political issue. And such deeply political issues are determined within temporary social arrangements that emerge from negotiations, frictions, competing claims, and conflicts. And in this paper, we are interested in the implications following from the position that these processes should be shaped democratically. We are inspired by the approaches of deliberative democracy and radical democracy. Deliberative democracy tells us to focus on the sites in which different arguments can be exchanged and translated into political agency, while acknowledging, of course, power relations that prevail everywhere. And radical democracy emphasizes the contingency, so the possibility of things being different, of all collective arrangement, and the necessity of confrontation. And it follows that our perspective requires the possibility to bring issues of societal concern to public dialogue, to politicize these issues and consider them as collectively shapeable rather than as purely technical and inevitable facts. And following this approach, the degree of transparency of a machine learning tool is to be measured by the quality of democratic deliberation that legitimizes its use. So taking the ideal of democratic deliberation and contestation as a point of departure, we identify 4 limitations to current approaches to transparency. First, transparency is largely centered around technology. The most important example, of course, is XAI, which aims to provide additional technical information about a given model. And other methods, such as model cards and data cards, do focus on social processes, but are still mostly articulated through technical means. And this precludes other and potentially more inclusive means of knowing algorithmic systems. Secondly, current approaches to transparency mostly focus on individuals as recipients of explanations or as addressees of disclosure. Matters of collective concern, like the temporalities of prediction, for example, cannot be addressed through these approaches. Third, the transparency Transparency is commonly approached in a unidirectional manner, in which engineers make a given technology transparent to ideally the public, and in this process, the concerns of the public do not shape that technology. Fourth, transparency problematizes machine learning primarily with existing models as a point of departure and attempts to create explanations, interpretations, or disclosures after the fact. And all in all, current approaches to transparency do not address the full spectrum of issues involved in democratizing the use of machine learning, not because they fail at this task they're developed for, but because they are developed for different tasks. And we don't argue for replacing the forms of transparency mentioned, expanding the concept of transparency towards transparency as a communicative constellation, or TAG for short, TAG at fact, is, in the words of Patricia Hill Collins, a brilliant thinker, a way of organizing the thinking tools, those that are already present and those that we add. And transparency as a communicative constellation refers to the societal level quality of the negotiations and debates around the development and application of a given technology. It is a societal achievement that emerges as the result of the communicative effort of multiple actors and includes translations across different fields, disciplines, domains, spaces, communities. And the project of building such a communicative constellation is never finished, rather it's an open-ended, ongoing endeavor. And this perspective opens connections to the field of science communication. Through enabling conversations about the facts and values involved in science and technology, science communication can be a vehicle for democratic deliberation rather than an afterthought in a grant proposal. Viewing transparency as a communicative constellation implies 4 perspective expansions which open up a larger field of transparency in which specific approaches that already exist can be mapped and analyzed systematically. First expansion is expanding the technical approach to transparency. One can inquire what it means in general for a machine learning system to be known. And this opens up the question of epistemology. What is known about what kind of knowledge is produced within a machine learning system? And epistemic transparency means the possibility of abstracting from a specific machine learning system to classes of systems that operate under the same paradigm, and thereby facilitating critique. Second expansion, we view transparency not as an individual, but as a collective effort happening in different fields and contexts, and it is located on a systemic and structural level, just like democracy itself. Third expansion, we call for an expansion from unidirectionality to multidirectionality. And in multidirectionality, forms of transparency that involve dialogue even before a system is constructed come into view. And deliberative and radical theories of democracy stress the importance of such dialogue and possible confrontation. And lastly, we propose an expansion from internal to contextual problematization. In internal problematization, it's attempted to render a given model transparent, for instance, by providing reasons for a particular classification. Contextual problematization also takes into account the model's social context and the various external concerns that might be at play. In our full paper, we illustrate the approach of TAG in a case study about an algorithmic system based in Austria to classify job seekers, and we describe implications for a number of societal groups, for instance, civil society actors, government agencies, science journalists, NGOs, critical scientists, fact people, and others. We invite you to have a look at the full paper, and we hope that our suggestions will itself prove to be a valuable component of future emerging communicative constellations. And thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you, Paula. As a reminder, we'll have combined Q&A with all of our speakers in the last 10 minutes. Next up, we have Maria Paz Hermosilla from Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez. Will be presenting about algorithmic transparency from the South, examining the state of algorithmic transparency in Chile's public administration algorithms.
Hello, hi. So I wanted to share with you the results of research we did collaboratively with the national agency that is in charge of the oversight of the access to information law in Chile, and with support of the Inter-American Development Bank. And basically what this research was done in 2021, and one of the things I'm excited to share with you, it's the basis for regulation that will be published this year and enacted next year. So the authors are Pablo Lapostol, Romina Garrido, and myself. We're all from GovLab at Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, and this is a private nonprofit university in Chile with a School of Government, and we're a public innovation lab focused on using data science, responsible use of data science to transform the public sector. So we do training, we do applied research, and we do collaborative advocacy. And the project that I'm going to show to you is a mix of applied research and collaborative advocacy. So the context of this research is the agency, the Chilean Transparency Council, which is not a government, it's an autonomous agency, kind of like the central bank in its legal standing. They were researching on algorithmic transparency, so they interviewed us. And we were, at the same time, in researching on algorithmic transparency, we had done many FOIA requests, and the door had been slammed in our faces. So it had been really hard to do this research, and they approached us and they said we should, they had some money and they said we could do some collaboration, and we proposed doing this research, and they said yes, and they funded it, and we did other things as well in this collaborative research. So what we designed first was a national survey of information. Then we chose a subset of those systems and we evaluated their transparency against a standard that we chose. I'll explain this later. And in the end, we also did a legal study on the current regulation, if it was possible or not to move forward with regulation considering the current laws. And we concluded that it was, and we actually proposed regulation, which is the one that is going to be published this year. So what is our scope of interest? It's not just artificial intelligence. Our scope of interest are what we call ADS or ADMs, automated decision-making systems, semi-automated or fully automated. We have, for example, a system in Chile that assigns children to schools. So that is just rules-based algorithm. It's in the law. And then we have software that detects diabetic retinopathy in eye exams. So it's the full spectrum from a basic algorithm to artificial intelligence and everything in between, okay? Explaining this wasn't easy. So we did a survey of 870 public agencies. Those are all the agencies that the council has purview over. But it was a collaborative study so that nobody was obliged to answer. We sent them an official communication and we asked for the minimum amount of information that we could to try to encourage a response, but those are the things we said. Name of the system, the purpose, if it uses or not personal data, just yes or no, and then what types of data, just like the heads of the columns, and then which unit within the agency is responsible for this system, and any links to public available information. That's it. What did we get? Responses, so we got a third, which is actually pretty good. The agency told us this is really good because they had done other studies and they had gotten like maybe 15% response. So it was pretty good, but of course it's not everything, and some of the major players did not respond. Ministry of Health, Ministry of Social Development. So even though we got a good view, it's still a partial view, okay? And most of them said they didn't have these systems, and only 20% said they did. And they reported many, many systems that were not ADS or ADM. So there was a lot of back and forth with some agencies. Some of them, like the Ministry of Housing, took this very responsibly. They formed a committee and they asked for a meeting and they really wanted to report all their systems. And so we had to exclude many systems like document management systems, just databases, electronic records, and things that were, but some people thought, I'll just better report everything just in case. So there's a big thing about nomenclature, and this has come up in other studies around, our Colombian partners, colleagues have done this research, have recently published a database of 113 systems. They also faced this issue. So what did we find in the end? 92 systems, and only 17 of them had information on the website of the public agency. So we found widespread opacity. We also found that 78% of these systems use personal data, and they were in all the areas that affect human rights: housing, criminal justice, health, education, and you name it. So basically, the results were very interesting in the sense that we found these systems to be really widespread in areas that are relevant, using personal data, and very opaque. So then we decided to choose 12 of them. To choose these 12, we went to the systems that had some available information. Doesn't matter if it was in the provider website, in the company website. And then we did a structured sample where we chose different policy areas, included COVID, of course, because that was a big issue at the time. And we looked at several frameworks that we could use to analyze if these systems were transparent. We were based on the meaningful transparency concept of Bernays and Goodman, and we ended up choosing the Ada Lovelace framework. So if you're interested in why, you can read our paper, and we ended up adapting the Ada Lovelace framework, and those are the questions that we ended up asking the systems, and we went out to look for any piece of information that was public online. What did we find? We actually found information for these systems in all kinds of different documents, but it was very heterogeneous, very, some was technical, some was not technical, and we had to do a big effort to kind of understand each of these systems and answer all those questions for each system. And one thing that did happen is that agencies would say, we had 14 cases where agencies said they didn't use systems, but they actually publicized that they were using artificial intelligence. And so, of course, that speaks to the siloed nature of the administration. But we emailed them back and we said, you publicly have said you use these systems. Do you want to change your response? Nobody responded. So we did find that some agencies actually are able to achieve a level of meaningful transparency with all these disparate documents that are everywhere, because Chile has a participation law. There's several other laws that have helped kind of some kind of disclosure, and of course we have the transparency law itself. But the audiences are very different. Everything is not standardized. It's really hard. It takes a lot of time to process this information. And actually the private sector also has a role. A lot of the information we found was on company websites that explain how the systems work. So then we did our legal study. 2 lawyers actually reviewed all the legislation from the Constitution to all the laws that regulate the public sector. And they decided that these systems are what we call an object, and so can be regulated by existing laws and the existing transparency law, which is from 2009. So we recommended to the agency, to the transparency agency, to put out what we call a general instruction, which is like an interpretation of the law that has the same force of the law. And in Chile, if you don't comply with the access to information law, the head of the agency gets their salary docked, okay? So there's a consequence. So we proposed a standard for what we call active transparency. That is basically every month, the agencies have to publish a certain type of information, including the salaries of public servants, for example, which is the most visited information in terms of transparency. So this would be just one more box in all the things that they need to publish, and it would be a list of algorithms with different information, which is very similar to what is in the framework of Ada Lovelace. And this is what we propose should be in the standard. So what happened? 2 months after we published our research, they announced that they were going to regulate. We were really shocked. We thought it would take them at least a year. It took them 2 months. And then we partnered with them with help of the Inter-American Development Bank, and we advised them all last year in a participatory process to design this regulation. They did a first draft based on our research and our proposal, and then we did workshops with regulated agencies. We did a pilot where 4 agencies published 7 algorithms on their websites. We did a workshop with users, and now there is a final draft that is set to be approved by the board of this agency, and there will be a public consultation. After they improve it with a public consultation, it should be published by the end of this year, and it will have 1-year vacancy. So Chile will be the first country in Latin America to have binding regulation in algorithmic transparency. Somebody said perhaps not just first in Latin America, but the world is a big place, so I don't want to claim that space. So we're really happy with this work, and appreciate any questions you might have. Here you can scan the paper, and there's our emails and our website. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Next up, we have Michael Luria from the Center for Democracy and Technology, who'll be talking about co-design perspectives and algorithm transparency reporting, guidelines and prototypes.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Michal Luria. I'm a researcher at the Center for Democracy and Technology. CDT is a civil society nonprofit that advocates for digital rights. So today I will be talking about a project that I worked on, co-designing perspectives on algorithmic transparency reporting, guidelines, and prototypes. Oh, it only works with this, apparently. Sorry. Okay. Nope. Not sure this is working. I could use the arrows, but they don't seem to work. I'm not sure. Okay, I could do that. Yes. Thanks. Okay, and now it works. So we started this research project with a question of what is algorithmic transparency in practice? There has been a lot of work on transparency and explainability, and over the years, researchers have created a body of work about frameworks, guidelines, and so forth on these topics. But recent work actually shows that there is still a gap between these frameworks and actual real-world implementation in industry, and pairing those principles with tangible manifestations. And so in this work, we attempted to address that gap. We did this through a two-part human-centered co-design research project. So we took a design research approach to this question and brought users to the table to collaborate with us. We also focused specifically on social media recommendation algorithms, as these are a critical component in what people get exposed to on an everyday basis. And we also focused on global transparency reports or explainers. There is a lot of work also on kind of in situ transparency, but there is also a need for some holistic space where people can have some kind of overview about algorithms, and not every piece of information is attached to a specific feature or mechanism within social media. So in the first session that we worked with participants, we did a foundational value finding study where we attempted to evaluate what is the current state of being and to create a foundation of what end users care about. Through this work, we attempted to create practical guidelines on how to create recommendation algorithm transparency reports. We then went off and created prototypes based on what people presented in our conversations. And through these prototypes, we attempted to explore opportunities for interactions with actual reports. So we then came back to our users and had them reflect on tangible expressions of their own ideas from session one. So going back to session one, we had 30 participants, everyday users, so casual users, and we attempted to recruit a diverse sample of genders, races, political orientations, technical orientations, and educational backgrounds. And we, together with participants, we went through several design-oriented activities to try to understand what are their needs. The first activity was a card sorting activity, where we listed a very long list of questions that platforms might be able to answer about how their recommendation algorithms work. And we asked participants to organize these questions on a scale between most important for me to know about and least important for me to know about. And as they were organizing these cards, we also asked them questions about why they decided to place a card in a particular place, or why is one card more important for them than another. After several card sorting activities, we prompted them to do a sketching activity where we kind of stepped aside and let them have 5-10 minutes to try to envision what an ideal version of an algorithmic transparency report would be to them. So we created this kind of template for them to work with, and these are a couple of examples of what participants came up with in this exercise. Lastly, we showed participants excerpts of actual privacy policy text from social media platforms to try to give them a sense of what is currently being shared about how algorithms work. And we had them reflect on what works within these descriptions, what doesn't work as well, and how platforms can improve. We then went out and, based on our findings in session 1, created 4 prototypes about recommendation algorithm transparency reports. These were not intended to be a template, but rather an exploration of what could be and how this information could be provided in a way that would support people's needs. And so we then came back to participants with these prototypes and used an experience prototyping method to have conversations about these different directions, and again, what works, what doesn't work, and what should be implemented moving forward. We had 16 participants for the second session, all of which were from the initial pool. So let's take a look at a couple of the prototypes. This is an example of an exploration of one of our findings where people were very interested in understanding the relationship between the data input and the output of the algorithm. Now, of course, technically, it's not a one-to-one relationship, but even some loose relationship between input and output was very valuable to participants. And so we attempted to create this interactive module where people could play around with data that they input or data that the platform has about them, and to see how that might impact some of the things that they end up seeing. As you can see, that we try to be neutral about which platform this is, because we are having conversations with a range of social media platforms, some of the bigger ones, but also some smaller ones that all could get some benefit from this work. Another example of a prototype that we showed participants was a place where they could see the different types of data that the platform has about them and how that data is being shared between partners and external platforms as well. So participants were very interested in their specific data that is used to feed algorithms and how that kind of moves around across different platforms that people use. We also added an interactive component here where people could not only observe the different types of data, but also move them around and decide what kinds of data they would feel less or more comfortable sharing. For example, on the left, publicly available data, or things that the platform will never share outside of their own platform. So our findings were in 3 categories: content, presentation, and language, and I will talk about the former 2. So in terms of content, one thing that participants deeply cared about, and this may not be surprising, is how their personal data is used in order to feed them recommendations. And so this is something that participants kept bringing up, having this understanding of how information is being used, and the more sensitive the information was, the more participants expected a very good explanation for why it's needed for social media platforms to use. They also wanted to know how it's being shared with external partners and how much control they have or don't have over that data. So even if they don't have control and they kind of can't change things, that was also valuable to participants. Things that participants cared less about was how the algorithm technically works and who it was designed for in the eyes of the platform. Now, this is not to say that platforms shouldn't be sharing this information at all, but specifically for this group of end users, this was not information that they thought was the most important to know about. In terms of the way the information is presented, participants very much appreciated that things were more visual and interactive. These are things that platforms are very good at doing, but it doesn't really come across in privacy policies and other transparency efforts. So there is definitely some UX designers that could hop on that boat and make a contribution in that space. Participants also appreciated that some of the information was personalized to them. Not all reports have to be personalized, but when it is personalized, it creates this personal connection to understanding what is being discussed, and those examples that are personally applied help them make this connection to something that is familiar. And lastly, control was really something that participants brought up throughout, and as I mentioned, not having control is also a valuable piece of information. So to conclude, we contribute insights about how platforms can provide recommendation algorithms reports to casual users through both guidelines, but also prototypes as a starting point for what this might look like in a way that would be engaging for end users. Our findings are just a starting point, and platforms need to continue this work and talk to users to really understand what is right for their users and other stakeholders that are part of their audiences, and to make sure that they adapt those needs to their own platforms. So thank you so much for your attention, and I would like to thank my colleagues who contributed to this work, and I look forward to the discussion at the end of the session. Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Devesh Narayanan from National University of Singapore, who will be talking about welfarist model grounding for transparent artificial intelligence.
Hello. Hi, thank you for coming. My talk is called Welfarist Model Grounding for Transparent AI. I'm a grad student in philosophy at National University of Singapore. Cool. I'd like to start by saying a bit about what model grounding as an analytical project entails. And I guess, one sec. Right. So as we know, right, transparency has been widely endorsed as a key principle for ethical AI. Most policy conversations around this feature some kind of demand for transparency. And I want to argue that this agreement at the level of principle masks a fair amount of confusion about why exactly transparency matters morally. And I want to think in a clear and systematic way about these kind of basic moral considerations that underlie calls for transparency. The approach so far has been, again, quite useful, right? So here are a bunch of things that morally desirable goods that we care about, and we want transparency because it helps us get these things, right? And that's very important work. But one can reasonably ask, right, why do these goods matter morally? Oh. Hang on. Oh, okay, it works. Sorry. Why do these goods matter morally? How does transparency help us get them? And I guess, what is the normative connection between transparency and, a package of moral goods, right? Similarly, on the other hand, there have been important moral critiques of the principle. Here, the approach has been to take what are morally desirable goods and say that transparency forecloses those and or needs to be traded off against those. And here, one might ask, well, should we defend the principle against these objections? Are there aspects of these critiques we should incorporate to sharpen our understanding of how and why to pursue transparency? So these are the kinds of questions that an attempt at moral grounding would try and hold front and center, right? In other words, we're trying to account in a systematic way for the various considerations that compete for attention when we're trying to think clearly about what we ought to do. And the thesis of this paper is that welfarism provides a theoretical basis for doing so. What's welfarism? I say more about this in the paper. For here, I think it's useful to think about this as a kind of family of moral views that hold these two commitments. First, that welfare is the only property of a state of affairs that has intrinsic moral value. And second, that the goodness of a state of affairs scales according to the amount of welfare it contains. Right? What this means is that welfarism is a consequentialist view. we assess the moral status of an action, in this case providing transparency, exclusively on the end state, the outcomes of providing transparency, right? Created as a state of, that's the idea. Welfare itself can be conceptualized in a bunch of different ways. Again, I say more about this in the paper. We'll stick at the level of pre-theoretical intuitions here, like things that, all things considered, advance our interests, make us better off, right? A little bit imprecise, I know, but hopefully this is like precise enough to get the argument going, but also general enough to retain an appeal to people who hold various moral views. Right. So on with it. Here's the view, right? Welfarism, on welfarism, it is desirable to make AI systems transparent insofar as pursuing transparency increases overall welfare, or maintaining opacity tends to reduce overall welfare. This might sound a little bit simplistic, and really the main argumentative thrust of the paper is to show that tracing the effects of transparency on welfare can clear up some of the confusions about why we care about transparency. Right. So to do this, I survey what I think are some of the more popular arguments for and against transparency and recast them in welfareist terms. This means that in each case I try and pick out the relevant moral good that transparency is supposed to either secure or foreclose, and then ask, well, how does this good relate to overall welfare? How does transparency help or hinder the pursuit of the welfare effects of this good? And finally, are there anything else we need besides transparency or the provision of information to secure the welfare benefits of these goods? Right? And this is, I guess, the main argumentative chunk of the paper. I try to show that by making these moves in each case, you can clear up certain ambiguities and inconsistencies in existing discussions about why transparency matters morally. I don't have time to go through all of this, I'm afraid, but I'll just pick one to illustrate, right? Trust. Okay. So, as we know, transparency is believed to provide an epistemic warrant for trust. Transparency helps us see on what grounds we should trust an AI system. And the welfare's first question to this is well, how does trust and adoption relate to overall welfare, right? Now, of course, in some cases where systems are deployed to a socially beneficial ends, trusting and adopting it could help realize some of these benefits, and welfareists would encourage trust on those grounds. But many systems, as this community knows all too well, cause quite a bit of harm, and in mistrust and resistance, especially among those who are disproportionately harmed, is warranted, and welfareists would support mistrust on those grounds, right? And so, for the welfareist, the moral desirability of transparency insofar it leads to trust is contingent on the end served by the system. And I think this is a useful way of thinking about it because sometimes we can kind of think about trust and adoption as things to be perceived as ends in themselves, as unalloyed goods. We always want trust. But obviously, right, if a surveillance system was made transparent, that doesn't on its own make it more worthy of our trust. And I think a focus on the downstream effects of providing transparency kind of helps us be more critical of such framings. Okay. Again, this is just a very brief taste. If this general type of move sounds interesting to you, please check out the paper. In my remaining time, I kind of want to focus more generally on what we gain analytically from a project like this, right? Why would someone bother with moral grounding? Okay. So here's one idea. Very often, attempts to articulate why transparency matters morally tend to pick out one or a few desiderata, like accountability or trust, or one or a few stakeholders, like decision subjects and their right to contest decisions, and defend the principle with generally exclusive reference to these, right? And I guess, I don't mean to this is very important work, right? These focus discussions are very important, but I think there is analytic value in being systematic. I think there's, to morally defend transparency with reference to a broad package of moral considerations. You could do this by trying to position, as some have tried to do, to position one aspect of this debate, like a right to explanation, as the one thing we care about. Or my approach offers an alternative, right? Because, which is to recast existing debates in welfareist terms and study it on those bases. And I guess because there are no strict constraints in terms of what can and cannot be analyzed in terms of their welfare effects, I think welfarism can do a pretty good job of capturing a rich and diverse set of moral reasons that animate our calls for transparency. I think that's a nice feature of the view. Okay. Here's another idea. We want to guard against cases where the mere provision of information is not enough, right? So here I'm thinking of cases where people have access to information in some thin technical sense, but no, not really, not really accessible to those who need it the most. Or cases where people have information but not the power to use this information to actually contest unfair decisions and achieve socially beneficial ends, right? Right. And because welfareism is explicitly concerned with ensuring that stakeholders can access information and meaningfully act on it to produce desirable consequences, this sort of thing is like very, very important to us, right? And I think, again, that's a very important feature of the view. It brings attention back to legal institutional factors that are required to make transparency morally useful. And that's like part of the view, right? You can't ignore it. Right. And a third kind of, I guess, personal motivation for writing this paper is many people kind of broadly welfareists or consequentialists, like the long-termists, have not really been interested in contemporary debates about transparency. I think this is welfareism becomes to be tarred by the same brush, and I think that's a great pity. I think that there's quite a bit of value in connecting welfareist thinking to like research, policy, and activist efforts to study the material effects of actually existing AI, the sort of work that happens here. Rather than trying to make like the theory's most implausible conclusions our main selling point. I think that's a weird thing to do. Yeah, I hope that my work offers like some inspiration for like more materially grounded welfareists to try and make some connections like these. Yeah. In slogan form, for welfareism to do moral grounding, we should ourselves remain grounded. Right. Okay. I'll leave you with this general point, which I think people have already made in this conference. Transparency is not just a call to look at a system's innards. It is it's a moral ideal about how we should relate to systems that make decisions about us, right? And I think it's when we approach this concept at this level of generality that we can start to get clearer about why and how to pursue meaningful transparency. I hope my account moves us a little bit in this direction, but much more needs to be said. Quick shout out to like Eric Corbett and Emily Denton's paper in like a previous session. That was really good. Also like the communicative constellation paper was really good. These are like all like attempts to like broaden transparency as a broader project. And I think that's really important work. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Devesh. Next, we have Helena Hailu-Nagatu from UC Berkeley, who'll be talking about co-designing for transparency, lessons from building a document organization tool in the criminal justice domain.
Okay. Can you all hear me? Yes? Okay, great. Hi, my name is Helena Hailu-Nagatu. I'm a second-year PhD student at UC Berkeley, and today I'm going to be talking about a 14-month co-design project that was led by a cross-disciplinary collaborative team in building a document organization tool for practitioners working with police use of force and misconduct data. And this is work done in collaboration with my co-author, journalist Lisa Pickoff-White, and my advisors, John Kenny and Sarah Chasins. So I'll start with a bit of a motivational background, and for that, I'm going to ask you to play pretend with me. So I want you to imagine that you're a public defender, and you have a court case in a few days that involves a police officer testifying against your client. Let's call this officer Officer Smith, and one thing that would be helpful in this case for you is if you had access to prior filings of misconduct, where, for example, Officer Smith lied on the stand. In an ideal scenario, you would have access to well-organized documents that you can just go to the folder that says Officer Smith, get the files that you need to prepare your defense. But in reality, what you have access to is unorganized document dumps that include stray PDFs, images, video, audio files, and semi-organized folders. So before you could prepare your defense, you first have to find the files that are related to your case. So let's step out of this play pretend and actually delve in on what is really included in these types of document dumps. For starters, there's an overwhelming amount of documents. You have partial or full exact duplicate copies of PDF files that might have the same name, might have different name, that are spread across your data dump. Looking at individual pages within each PDF, you might have narratives, forms, emails, handwritten documents that all affect how you extract information, such as officer names or case numbers from your PDF files. You also have legibility issues where files that have the same underlying content might differ based on the level of redaction, the type of redaction, the quality of scans, and physical alterations to the PDF pages. You also typically have files that belong to the same case that are coming from different agencies being scattered across your document hierarchy. So you can imagine the files that come from the Department of Justice, the police department, and the medical report all being scattered within your document hierarchy. And finally, with large PDFs that have hundreds and thousands of pages, you have cases where different case files belonging to very different cases are all blended together in one large PDF. So before you could do your job, you first have to split this large PDF, identify individual cases, and find the files that you are interested in. This type of overloading practitioners with large amounts of data is used as a strategy within the legal system. This is an article from the New York Times about how Abbott kept defense attorneys in the discovery stage by sharing large amounts of folders for them to process as they were preparing for their defense. So it's not just public defenders that deal with messy data, but defense attorneys, investigative journalists who are trying to hold institutions accountable, as well as organizations such as the NACDL who work with such practitioners, all have to deal with messy, unorganized data dumps. So with this, we see that there's a clear need for a data organization and cleaning tool for practitioners working with limited resources. And in our work, we wanted to know how we could best understand their needs to successfully build a tool for them. We approached this by having a computer scientist collaborate with data journalists, public defenders, and the NACDL in a cross-disciplinary collaborative team that underwent a 14-month co-design process to build a document organization tool, which we call DOT, for domain experts working with police use of force and misconduct data. Throughout the rest of this talk, I'll answer these 4 questions, and I'll start by answering how we approached our co-design and what exactly did we find from that. For our co-design methodology, we used what is termed in the scholarship as design by immersion, whereby I, the designer, learned and enacted the manual data processing of our domain experts, and then shared and discussed the outputs of my manual data processing. I then proposed tools, interventions, and solutions to our domain experts, and they helped me by identifying edge cases where my proposed solutions might not work. Finally, I developed the tools with the same data sets that our domain experts work with daily, and they give me feedback on the design and implementation decisions. And we went through this process iteratively, refining our design at each step. We categorize the findings from our co-design process into 2. The first is data needs, or tasks that our domain experts have to accomplish in their day-to-day activities. And the second is design goals that we had to set in order to meet our users' priorities and workflows. Coming to the data needs, we identified 3 major tasks that our users have to do. The first is data cleaning, data extraction, and data organization. And as you can see from the icons that are placed on the slides, these 3 data needs tackle the exact challenges that I have outlined at the beginning of this talk. In fact, the way that we arrived at taxonomizing those data challenges is by going through this co-design process. Coming to the design goals, we collaboratively set 5 design goals, and in this talk, I'll focus on 2 of them, and I encourage you to read our paper for details about the other 3. The first design goal I'll talk about is human control and intervention. With this, we saw that we had the constraint of working in a very high-risk domain, and through iteration, we found that our domain practitioners preferred to be actively involved in the decision-making as we were organizing the documents, rather than correcting after the fact once everything was fully automated. And the implication from this constraint was that our design should prioritize supporting users in organizing their data, rather than automating the whole process for them and attempting to replace them. The second design goal I'll talk about is high-level abstraction. And with this, we saw that there was a trade-off between how flexible and usable our tool could be versus how plug-and-play it is. And the implication is that for us to go to the furthest end of the spectrum in terms of usability and flexibility, while at the same time requiring minimum training from our users to onboard onto our tool, we had to understand where our users are in terms of technical needs and technical skills and meet them where they are. And I'll say more about this later on in the talk. Now I'll talk about what exactly did we build. Here I'm showing one abstraction from our dot feature, which is the classify and get pair correlation function. So a user has unorganized document dumps, and they call this function in order to do one of their tasks. And underlying this abstraction are the 4 building blocks that you see on the slide. And our users don't have to know the technical details of any of these algorithms or techniques that we use, even though they can if they want to. And I'm also not going to ask you to know any of the details about these building blocks. Basically, our design shields our users from these low-level implementation details, and they can just call a function to do a task that they're interested in. Here's a full system diagram of Dot as a whole. Basically, you have unorganized documents coming in, and usually users go through the sequence of data cleaning, extraction, and organization. And at the end, you would have well-organized documents based on the programmer set parameters. And all the data challenges that we've talked about at the beginning of the talk are addressed throughout the entire pipeline. Now I'll answer the question, what programming paradigms work for our users? And the reason we asked this question is because through our collaboration, we found that some domain experts had become self-taught programmers in order to automate some of their tasks because the data that they were dealing with was too massive to process manually. So we started with 2 research questions. We first wanted to know, with the appropriate abstractions already implemented, how should we best present our tool for our set of users? And we also wanted to know, for a non-technical audience such as our target users, what are the relative strengths of available programming paradigms? To test this, we conducted a within subject study where we built paradigm-specific interfaces on top of our Dot library and presented Dot as a visual, programming by example, and text-based paradigm. Coming to the results, for the first research question, surprisingly, we found that it really didn't matter which paradigm we were using as long as the right abstractions were implemented. As you can see from the histograms, by the time users got to the 3rd task, they were taking about the same amount of time to complete the task, regardless of which interface they were using. Coming to the relative strengths of each programming paradigm, we found that text-based allowed our users to explore outside of the abstractions that we provide by, for example, importing outside libraries and writing their own functions. Visual allowed us to give them information such as histograms that showed them the status of their data, which they later used as they were writing their programs. And programming by example put the focus on the data. That is, our users were more interested in the examples that they were giving rather than the program that was being generated for them. And finally, I'll leave you with reflections or lessons learned from our design process. In our paper, we highlight 4 reflection points, but in this talk, I'll focus on 2 of them. The first is that our long-term engagement allowed us to build a collaborative, trusting, and supportive team, which lowered barriers to communication, which we think are essential for the success of our project. And I'll also talk about how we were able to put prototypes into practice through this collaborative process by sharing early stage prototypes as well as outputs with our collaborators that they actively used in their work as we were refining the design. With that, I will end my talk on our 14 months co-design process, and I encourage you to read the paper and reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.
At this point, I'd invite all of the speakers to come back up on stage. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Do you want to on stage? You can use that mic. Get your third mic if you want.
We should probably all be on the same side.
You can use the mic.
Okay, so I'm going to start with an online question that was asked anonymously. It says it's a methodology question for Helena. They ask, what is the scalability of co-design approaches, or is the point of these co-design approaches that it is scaled down to personalizable groups?
That is a great question, and we addressed that a little bit in our paper as well. The goal of collaborative design projects like this is to focus on transferability rather than generalizability. It's hard for me to say that word. But yeah, I encourage you to read our paper for more details on that.
Hi, I'm Mickey Vorvorano from Microsoft. I have a question for Devesh. But first, congratulations, everyone. Thank you for great papers. Congratulations, Maria, for the impact your work has had. So, Devesh, I look forward to reading the paper. I'm sure there's more in it than what you mentioned about trust. But my first question is, working at Microsoft, I must confess that we find product adoption to be a pretty good thing. However, we don't necessarily consider trust always to be a good thing. Because we don't want our users to, follow the legendary GPS and drive into lakes. So what we think about is creating appropriate trust, where people know when and how much to trust, so they don't trust too much or too little. And so I was wondering what your thoughts are about this idea that trust, is not necessarily considered overall a good thing. Too much trust can be a bad thing. And how would you contextualize that within the approach that you wrote about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't mean to pitch, but I actually have a paper about this. Yeah, it's about trust as an attitude. I think the idea of so in this paper I try to talk about how appropriate reliance, right, the calibrated reliance idea of trust, can seem it seems quite weird in some places to call that trust, because if you're scrutinizing and deliberating in each case, in what way are you trusting it, right? Trust is a kind of a thick relation between everything. So that's the paper, and then argue that transparency is kind of at odds with this. So anyway, that aside, right? I think so yes, I think that calibrated reliance is the good thing, right, that we want to get, as opposed to trust in this thick, full-blooded sense. But I think the connection between trust and adoption can also be severed, as you pointed out, right? You can adopt it without trusting it and adopt it in this kind of guarded, cautious way. And then yet, adoption can also, you can also call for the adoption of problematic technologies, which again, our first we will want to call against. So, in each case, you can sever the link between the connections to overall welfare, and this paper tries to focus on that last link, but yeah, it's a good question. I'm gonna, maybe we can talk about it a bit more.
Yeah, for sure. And read my other paper is a great answer.
I'm sorry about that. but yeah.
Hi, my name is Miria Yurrita, and I'm from TU Delft. My question is about transparency reporting guidelines. So you mentioned that the users or the participants you were working with were very interested in knowing more about the data, the way the data that goes into the system, the outputs that they get, because they wanted control, et cetera, I was wondering whether you found any insights into what they would do next, right? So transparency for what? That would be my question in this regard. So were there any thoughts on whether they would change the behavior based on this information that they were getting, whether they would, drop the platform as a whole, or whether they would tweak the way they were sharing the data? So were there any insights into what they would do next? So it was interesting to bring transparency, but for what? That would be my question. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think overall, people are not very excited about dropping platforms altogether, especially ones that they enjoy. But what we saw is that when information is not provided, people assume the worst. So if you don't tell them what is going on, then people assume you're always monitoring, always listening, Alexa's listening, all these things that are not necessarily true. So I think it's actually an incentive for industry to provide more information because it both kind of encourages them to self-reflect on exactly what they're doing with data and how they're using it and why. But also, it might actually reassure participants that it's not as bad as they might imagine, which is quite a consistent finding that we found. Thanks.
Hi, thanks everybody for your talks. I have a question for Devesh. About welfarism in general. So I'm familiar with the concept of welfare from economics, where, if agents have utility functions, you can think of the utilitarian social welfare as the sum of all those, values. And so in that domain, you end up with this concept of welfare as a very kind of universal and transferable thing, almost like money. And so I guess I'm wondering, if you adopt a welfarist perspective in general, in the kind of sense that you're talking about it, are you necessarily kind of locked in to thinking about welfare as this very universal and kind of transferable, unit? Or is that an extra step that economists have made, but is not necessary?
It's a great question. I feel a little bit unsure about how to answer, but I'll say a little bit about what I know. Okay, briefly, right? I think welfarism is inherently connected with that economistic conception. Even the concept that I use is from Amartya Sen, economist, philosopher type thing. Yeah, so that connection is quite thick. I do think that there have been modern attempts in to take back welfarism from this attempt, and I think I see myself in this tradition of welfarists who are who care more about differential impact, for instance. So in the paper I write about how we have a special duty to care about the welfare effects of like those who are most marginalized, because yeah, I think you can get like special considerations from welfareist views. You can also get a care about inequality, and some of my colleagues are working on these ideas. So I think it's starting to come apart, but like it's problematic, and it's a project to rescue welfareism from that view.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is also for Devesh. Sorry about that. So you were saying that welfareism would be a way to address the diversity and bring things together. What would you say about value systems that are based more on other types of ethics, virtue ethics, deontological ethics? Because what I'm seeing, I had a paper on honor ethics where basically there's actual dissensus and there's values that are actually opposed to each other, and so I'm just wondering what you think about like when there are systems that kind of rub up against each other.
So there, like the other big attempts to do the kind of work that like moral grounding projects in about transparency, like tend to take, I think, deontological views. Seth Lazar has an amazing paper. Kate Werenberg also has a so there are a couple of these like rights-based views on welfareism. I think they get us pretty far. They're really good papers, and I think there's some advantages of my view. And I think so something about like thinking about trade-offs, trying to account for. So I don't think it's like the welfareist view is necessarily better in these in handling diversity, but it takes a different approach in that you're not saying that one like the right explanation is more like basic than like the other, like accountability, for instance. You're doing everything in terms of welfare. So it's a different approach, but you can get very far with the right explanation, right? So that's
Is there still time? Okay. Hi everyone. I'm Tiana Barrett. I'm from Howard University, but I'll also be working at the University of Washington for a PhD. And I think this question is for anyone and all of you to answer, but I feel like an important aspect or value in transparency is the move towards standardization or standardizing things. But given the context of the first paper that's presented, how can standardization lead to a loss of or in support of building transparency as a more living, ongoing project?
Well, I would have to say that's a big challenge when working with transparency is what you will become, what will you communicate, what information will you put out there, and not everybody has all the same categories. So and currently in the world we're seeing a lot of efforts to make these AI systems or algorithms more transparent, and there's not necessarily these categories are coming together. So one thing is being done in one place. Basically, we're having data that is not, it's not homogeneous, and so we're going to have a lot of problems because of this in understanding what is happening in general with algorithms, because we're going to have different versions of information in different places. So I think we are kind of, even though we're moving forward, we are creating problems for the future because we're not doing standardization. So that's what I would have to say about that.